Hello, everybody. I don't know where you are in the world, far flung. I know we have a lot of people in America, but wherever you are in the world, welcome. My name's Viv Lawes, and over the next hour, I'll be talking about Antoni Gaudí, this absolute genius. What is it that makes him such a genius? Well, I hope that will unfold as we go through the talk. So I've called him the master builder of Barcelona. Because he's best known for his work within Barcelona. But of course, he does have other works in existence throughout parts of Spain. I've been to a wonderful palace in Asturias. Perhaps some of you out there have also been to this, which was sort of emerged out of the landscape like this thing from outer space. And it is that sense of the fantastic which is so extraordinary in Gaudí's work and makes him so compelling. I'm going to start just with this first image, but actually I'm not going to talk about Sagrada Família until the end, because I just want to set the scene here. He's born in 1852 and he is a Catalan by birth. And as a young man, he goes to Barcelona to train in the regional school of architecture that was set up in the early 1870s. And this photograph here from 1887 shows those early stages. It looks like something from, a different planet, doesn't it? As you see this sort of fully fledged carved columns with these pointed arches that recall the Gothic, emerging out of the earthworks, like some sort of historical set piece. It's extraordinary. And this is what we'll come back to at the end, but we'll start with thinking about Gaudí himself. So he's born into this culture, which is very, very particular. And it is this particularity that makes him such an extraordinary architect. He is known for something which is classed as Catalan modernism. And Catalan modernism is basically the Art Nouveau of Catalonia. And on the right here, you see the first director of that provincial school of architecture that was set up in the early 70s. And it's the man under whom Gaudí studies, amongst others. But what is Catalan modernism? What is the Art Nouveau of Catalonia? And it is this system. We're just waiting for the tabs to work. Sorry about this. What is it about Catalan modernism? Well, first of all, I want you to think in the context of Barcelona itself. It has more buildings on the UNESCO World Heritage List than any other city, and all those buildings are modernist. So it's all this particular phase from the late 1870s to around about 1910, and the building that continues on from that in this particularly rich and vibrant period. Modernism grows out of effectively the Catalan Renaissance. Now, when we think of the Renaissance, we think always, don't we, of the Italian Renaissance and how it spreads out into northern and western Europe. The Renaissance in Catalonia comes at a much later date, and it's a term which is one that is misleading in some ways, because of course Spain went through the Renaissance in the 16th century, like so much else within Europe that spread out of Italy from the 15th century. But it was another Renaissance, and my pronunciation in Spanish is absolutely terrible, so I will make one effort to say Renaixença, but I will just refer to it as the Catalan Renaissance. This is about urban growth. It's about economic growth, and it is absolutely tied into literature, so culture much more widely. Now, there's one piece of literature that I want you to sort of remember because it's relevant for Gaudí, and that is the work of Joaquim Verdaguer, who was a writer working at the same time as Gaudí. He's an older contemporary of Gaudí, and he writes an important poem called Atlantida. And there is a theme of dragons in this poem, and this is a theme that comes out in Gaudí's work. Essentially, the poem, which is based on Plato's description of the downfall of the mythical island of Atlantis. And according to Plato, Atlantis, this real drawbridge, was shattered by the hand of God because he wanted to separate the worlds at the time of corruption into them in later centuries to be brought together by the beautiful arms, the giant arms of Columbus. So this Catalan poet conflates Plato and that discussion of Atlantis, this mythical city, and he says that basically what Columbus does is he saves Atlantis and he embraces it. And what he does is he makes Columbus, who of course is Portuguese, but works for Spain, is he makes Columbus the equivalent of Hercules, of Heracles in the Greek. And in doing that, he talks about Spain's greatness, and more particularly, he talks about Catalonia's greatness. And the theme of Barcelona, the theme of dragons, you see both in that poem and taken up by Gaudí, and the third connecting factor with Barcelona and dragons is that St. George, who famously kills the dragon, he's the patron saint of England, of course, but he's also the patron saint of Catalonia. And so that idea of killing the dragon, of humanity overcoming all obstacles, of bravery, of the virtue of the soldier, the Christian soldier, we have this all conflated together. So the dragon is a really important symbol in the Catalan Renaissance and for Gaudí, who is working within that oeuvre. The Renaissance itself was a 19th century movement, and it's essentially a romantic movement, and combined with this love of the medieval past, which is the Romanesque, particularly the Gothic, which was a trans-European style, building style, artistic style, even literary style. There is also fused into it the Arab exotic. It's the Mudéjar, the Moorish history of the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, in the 7th and 8th centuries, 2/3 of the Iberian Peninsula was part of a Islamic state. So remember that Muslim culture that permeates Spain and Portugal's history is very much present within this Renaissance of the Romantic movement of Catalonia. Also, we have this idea of nationalism. So the arts, this self-reference to the culture of Catalonia, that specificity within Spain, and then Spain within Europe, is all mixed together in the arts and in literature and in politics. And the idea is to revive this Catalan culture, but while modernising it. So it's not to revive the medieval past and keep it as the medieval past, but it's to modernise it. It's this new face of Catalan culture. And when we think of this Renaissance, we have to remember that this theme runs throughout Gaudí's work. So let's just wait for my screen to react. There's a bit of a go slow here. I'm just trying to get it to move on to the next slide. We can gaze at Elise Rogent for a little longer. Here we go. So moving into Gaudí himself, let's have a look at one of his great influences, and that's his fellow architect, Luis Montana. He was an important figure because what he did is he put into the form of a journal, a review called The Renaissance, and he talked about a national architecture. So he was a politician as well as an architect himself, and he was an essential figure in defining the architecture of modernism. His article here, En busca de una arquitectura nacional, In Search for National Architecture, published in 1878 in this review, The Renaissance, which had been founded in 1871, around the same time as the School of Architecture. 1878 is also an important date in Gaudí's own history, because this is when he graduated from the provincial architecture school. And on the right here, you'll see Montana's building from 1888, which was the what was for then the restaurant for the World's Fair. Now, the World's Fair took place in Barcelona in 1888, and it's a crucial date, and the one that's often given as the start of the true Catalan Renaissance. It's arguable, some people put it much earlier because of all the literary background, but anyhow, it is one of the dates that's put forward. And the World's Fairs, just remember what these are. The modern incarnation of the World's Fair was the great exhibition known colloquially as the Crystal Palace in London, in Hyde Park, in 1851. And there were world fairs in European cities from that date onwards. So Barcelona has its World's Fair in 1888. It means that the world comes to you. And this is where you show off, rather like the very unfortunate Japanese Olympics in Tokyo at the moment, where all those crowds should have been there for all this vast concentration of money and organisation. The World's Fair was like the cultural equivalent of that. So he builds this restaurant, the Castel de Tres Dragons, dragons again here, as you see, and it's extraordinary for its use of visible ironwork within the structure, and also the use of ceramics as visible elements. So in arguing for this national architecture, he builds to reflect those ideas. Now, Montana, you can see in this closer image here, which is also done from a different angle, you can see that ironwork. Look at that pinnacle there with those wonderful medieval roofs. They're like Gothic churches, aren't they? You can really see that move between the sacred and the secular in this building. Also, it's castellated, so it's like a medieval fortress, so you're getting that medieval element coming through. You note also the use of ceramics here. When you look at that layer of shield shapes that you see in white, which are painted in blue here, that is referring to the earth itself, ceramics of course, and also the importance of ceramics in Spain's history. So Spain was the place where all those skills of the Arabic world in, for example, the luster glazing that you see in the kind of ceramics that were exported to Italy in the Renaissance, and that were copied, you know, as forms, as artistic forms in Italy. So that is deep within the medieval heritage of Spain, and here he's using it within this particularly Catalan context. So you have all these nuanced allusions here to this Catalan Renaissance. So this is Montana, and this Hispano-Arabic architecture again goes back to the past. So what are the origins? So first of all, we have the Mudéjar style and its incarnation in the 19th century, the Neo-Mudéjar style. This gives you an example. So on the left-hand side, you see the original Mudéjar style. These are three arches that are shown within the Alcazar Palace within Seville, so built in the 1360s. And you can see here what you have the use of is something called the horseshoe arch, which you can see very clearly both on the original building and on an example of Neo-Mudéjar architecture, the Grand Theatre in Cadiz. Built in 1884, it absolutely encapsulates that Mudéjar medieval style. So we have the horseshoe arch that you can see very, very clearly. You also have the use of tiling, and the tiling is also featuring something called the arabesque, and the arabesque means a form of geometry, often interlaced geometric structures that are also foliate in style. So you have that mixture of geometric abstract and foliate forms, and it's specific to Muslim architecture in not having a representation of either human beings or beasts. And you also have that ornamentation of brickwork, which you can see very clearly in the Grand Theatre, that lovely alternation of dark and light brickwork that gives an extraordinarily rich and exotic facade to the building. So that's just one example of this tradition within which Gaudí was growing. If we look a bit more closely, you can see here the stylized Arabic script that becomes so decorative, whether you speak or read Arabic or not. You can see that it's script, but without being able to read it, you will take it just for its decorative value. But of course, those who could read it, you know, it has a spiritual meaning as well. And that richness, typically here, the colours that you associate with Hispano-Moresque ceramics, which was so important for the Italian Renaissance, that wonderful cobalt blue, the underglaze colour, and then that wonderful iron red, which will have a lustre glaze within it to make this incredibly rich and reflective and a decorative surface. So this is what we have going on at the time. So where does Gaudí come in? Well, here is one of his early works. Now, this was built in around about 1883, the Casa Vicens here. And bearing in mind, he was 5 years out of the architecture school at this date. He graduates in 1878, so he's a very young man at this stage. So this building, you can see some of the forms that we've already discussed. There's no horseshoe arch visible in this facade, but another of those stylistic devices which you typically see in mosque architecture, you see it within carpets as well from the Muslim world, and that's what's called the stepped arch. And I'm going to point to it here with a nice red pen. So here you have the stepped arch. It's that wonderful shape, almost pagoda-like, isn't it? That is a typical feature. You also have turrets, something I didn't mention on the previous slide. Up here, we've got these turrets which give that recollection. It's nuanced in terms of the turrets that you see in the minarets of mosque architecture and you see throughout the Muslim world. Also, notice that sawtooth ornamentation that you see in the brickwork, which is very difficult to see here, but you've got the sawtooth is effectively this shape, which you can possibly just about see up here. This is not high enough resolution to get a close-up. Now, you also have within the interior of the Casa Vicens, you also have something called the Margallo palm. And the Margallo palm is a Catalan type of low-growing palm that grows out in the wild. And what you can see on the right-hand side is that detail. These are the iron gates that are around the property. And that wonderful sort of exploding star kind of shape that you see on the right-hand side, that is an image of the Margallo palm. Now, that is a motif we will see again and again with Gaudí. You realise the more that you look at his work, how certain motifs are repeated again and again. And they are not only his signature style, but don't forget, of course, his signature style is to constantly innovate. So we don't look for anything staying still, but they are also things that relate specifically to his origins and to the region, to Catalonia, to Spain more generally, and so on. So these are the things we are looking for, and it's what makes him so recognisably Catalan. The other origin, and you cannot possibly discuss Gaudí without looking at this, is actually what's happening at the time much more broadly. And for that we need to look at international Art Nouveau, because Catalan modernism is referred to as Catalan Art Nouveau. So what's going on internationally? What we see are works, for example, like this by Peter Behrens, for his German form of Art Nouveau, which is known as Jugendstil, the youth style. Art Nouveau, in essence, grows out of Francophone countries. So we're looking Belgium and France in particular for its early origins, but it spreads very quickly. It is an international style. If you think of America, we're talking Tiffany here for American Art Nouveau. So what we see in Art Nouveau are things based on nature. So, for example, very popular, botanical and marine life, insects and birds, metamorphic forms, which means changing forms. So I would be half fish, half human. It's how we feel sometimes, especially after lockdown. Yeah, okay. So those metamorphic forms where you are in one body, two or more creatures. You're looking for sinuous lines, and by sinuous, what do we mean when we see a sinuous person? We look at somebody who has very little fat. You can see the structure of their bodies underneath. There's a tension in sinuous curves. There's a sense of that tension making these curves very strong, very definite. And they're often referred to with Art Nouveau as whiplash curves. And a whiplash is something that is this shape, okay? It's a sharp curve that you have. This is what you can see in the Peter Behrens drawing of the kiss here. So when we come to Catalan Art Nouveau, we have this mixture of an international Art Nouveau movement. It goes back to the arts and crafts movement. I could go into endless detail, but I have to not do that. But that is that movement in the States. Of course, people like Frank Lloyd Wright, very good example of that. The medievalism of the Gothic revival. So not only is the Gothic building style in church architecture and in secular architecture hugely dominant from about 1150 through to about 1500, in many parts of Europe, you also have the revivalism of the Gothic in the 19th century. So here in the UK, for example, it would be things like the Houses of Parliament or Tower Bridge, you know, something that's 19th century but Gothic in style. And you also have this Arab exotic, which I've touched upon so far in the Neo-Mudéjar architecture. So if we look at comparatives at the time of Gaudí, one example would be for this Tassel House, which is one of the big villas that Victor Horta, the preeminent Belgian Art Nouveau architect and artist, designed in the 1890s, where it's all sinuosity, it's all those whiplash curves, it's those organic forms growing up as if they've emerged from cracks in the wall. And it's a very strange place. When I went here, as a member of the press, actually, many years ago, I was full of admiration. I mean, it blew me away, just the coherence of the vision. But I started to feel somewhat claustrophobic. And that's one of the things of Art Nouveau, is it's all encompassing. And it's the fine arts and the decorative arts as well. In other words, it's objects as well as paintings and sculptures. It is a complete work of art. So there's a purity of style, and you see that purity with Gaudí. To give an idea of how biological forms, you have artists such as the scientist, preeminently a scientist, Ernst Haeckel, who made volumes of paintings that became prints, lithographs, high quality, where he uses the biological illustrations of real life forms in nature, but creates them like a painting. He's making almost like a still life here. So it's the art that you see in nature, and it's making illustrations of nature become artworks as well. So again, contextual material for this Art Nouveau, for what Gaudí keys into with his Catalan identification. Beautiful example here, this brooch by Georges Fouquet, so a French example here, his orchid brooch of 1898. You know, absolutely typically Art Nouveau, almost like if you imagine something Art Nouveau, imagine sculpting it out of wax, okay? And then imagine just melting that wax very slightly so that it goes a little bit droopy and a little bit soft at the edges. That's how I always think of Art Nouveau, it's all a little bit droopy. But in terms of biological accuracy, just take an example from the 1831 edition here of William Curtis's Botanical magazine, founded in 1787 and still going. You can see again that truth to nature as well as its artistic interpretation. You only have to think of the metro. Here's the Port Dauphiné metro, and you know, what else is it like? Well, there are plant forms looking at the outside, but actually look at that roof. It's like an insect's wing, isn't it? It is just like an insect's wing. So we have, again, this, if you imagine this crawling, crackling, creeping nature that is so evident in Art Nouveau. And all these influences, they come together. And a brilliant example of metamorphosis that I've mentioned in my list is this work by René Lalique. And it is now in the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. And one visitor, and actually an English visitor, this was shown in the World Fair of 1900. And this World Fair was the one effectively where Art Nouveau was launched as this international style. People like Siegfried Bing, who had his gallery Art Nouveau, which the style was named after. One English visitor looked at this wonderful Lalique metamorphic form and said, "It's very remarkable and startling to the observer, but is it jewellery?" Well, is it? It's a big object. It's about this big, and yes, you could wear that as jewellery, but it's sculpture, and I think nothing better illustrates those nebulous definition of what is fine art, which is an object that's about ideas, in essence, very complex and long subject, that you distill into paintings on the walls or installations or digital art now, but it's about ideas. It's something that doesn't have a use as in a practical function. But you think of this, is this sculpture? Well, it is sculpture, but it's in a small scale that can therefore be used. And that middle ground, that grey ground of what is fine art and what is decorative art or craft really dissolves, and it's particularly evident in Art Nouveau. So the true birth of Catalan modernism, okay, let's take it as being defined as, perhaps we'll say its maturity in 1888 at the Barcelona World Fair. And this is the one point at which I want you to imagine yourself taking that cruise that's been so cruelly denied to us by this microscopic virus, and imagine yourself in the harbour at Barcelona now. And what will you see in that harbour? Well, in 1888, you might have seen this and bought this very, very postcard, the Columbus Monument at Port Vell. Now that is the port, and I know because I've done it on Viking, where you come in and as you walk out of the exit, whether you're on a minibus or whether you choose to do it on foot, that's what you see. And this is from that 1888 Expo, and it is there to celebrate, of course, the Portuguese Christopher Columbus, who was working for the Spanish monarchy, seeking out the new worlds, going to America, going across the Atlantic, taking these huge risks. And this was designed by a Catalan artist and architect called Monrava. And what you'll see nowadays is not so different. So this is a view of the port as you would see it now. So just take yourself into that erstwhile cruise, and when you can do it, remember that this is that view that you will see, and take your time to look at it. But if we get back into the virtual world again, let's look at what Gaudí did. So we now know the context, don't we? We understand Art Nouveau, we understand that medievalism, we understand that yearning for Spanish and specifically Catalan history with that Arab exotic. This is what we've got going on. Now, no artist can exist without patrons. They are often the underreported pillar of the art world as it exists now. And this man, Eusebi, well, he is the really important constant in Gaudí's life. He employs him when he's a new graduate. Now, he met Gaudí at the International Expo in Paris of 1878, so 10 years before Barcelona, there was an expo in Paris. So the two had known each other from the time that Gaudí first graduated. And they did many works together. So we have the Palaguel, the Park Güell, also the Colonia Güell, which was a sort of model town built for industrial workers. Now, Güell was a textile, he was an industrialist. One of his other great patrons was a textile baron, who I'll show you later. And what we have with Güell is this extraordinary undertaking. And he starts with asking Gaudí to add to an existing estate. So this estate is in the university, what's now the University District of Barcelona. And I'm just going to show you this one image, because the building itself remained largely as an older building by a previous architect. And what he asked Gaudí to do is to put these gates around the estate. And what do we have here but the dragon? Okay, so we have this very important mythological feature. Remember, St. George, patron saint of Catalonia. Remember our poetry, Atlantis conflated, Hercules conflated with Columbus. So what is the conflation with Hercules in that poem that I mentioned at the beginning? Well, Verdaguer, the poet, was, and it's an epic poem, he was recounting the legend of Hercules' 11th labour. Remember, Hercules was tasked with these 12 labours, and his 11th labour was to get the apples from the garden of Hesperides, those golden apples that he holds in his hands eventually. And to get those apples, he has to defeat the guardian dragon, who's called the Ladon, L-A-D-O-N, the Ladon. And he manages, of course, to defeat the Ladon and get those golden apples of Hesperides. And that conflation with Columbus, what does he do? He charges across the Atlantic. He survives the vicissitudes of that epic journey. He founds America, and he acts for the Spanish identity, despite the fact he's Portuguese. So what you see here is that aggrandizement of this mythological foundation myth. Effectively, it's a national foundation myth for Catalan identity, and he's planting it here in the estate of one of the wealthiest men in Barcelona, in Catalonia, indeed. Now, if we go and look at the first building that Gaudí actually does for Güell, we have here the Palau Güell within Barcelona, and this is something that is quite restrained by Gaudí's normal oeuvre, which we associate actually with his slightly later works. So this is, only starting in the mid 1880s, taking 5 years. But what I really wanted to show, as you see with my little arrow here, is the parabolic arch. Because there are certain shapes. So we have our dragon motifs, we have the Art Nouveau sensibility of these organic forms and insects and so on. We have also the Hispano-Moresque elements, the minarets, the sawtooth brickwork, the contrasting brickwork, the interlacing geometric forms. And we also have with Gaudí the parabolic arch. We also have the catenary arch. They're almost the same, the parabolic and the catenary. The only difference between them, and I'm not a mathematician, but some of you out there will be, in visual terms, is you have this parabolic shape where the feet at the bottom of the archway, if you're standing it upright, in the parabolic arch, it tends to be slightly wider than the catenary arch, but they look very, very similar. And the easiest definition I can think of to make this feel memorable is if you imagine a chain around your neck. Perhaps some of you are wearing a chain right now. And if you just suspend it from two hands like that so that it takes its own shape, that is your catenary arch, okay? Whether it's downwards or whether it's upwards. And the parabolic arch, the only difference really mathematically is that the parabolic arch has vertical weight pressing on it from outside sources, and the catenary arch it's just its own weight, its own forces. If you imagine that, that is a motif to look for continually in Gaudí's work. You can see it here at the bottom. You can see the ornamentation up here. So, for example, we have this wonderful organic ornamentation, these very organic forms here. They almost look like intersecting snakes or bunches of grapes from a distance. It's an abstract form. And if we look a little bit closer up, you can see again, for example, here's the whiplash curve. Okay, so we've seen the whiplash curve internationally with Art Nouveau. Here it is with Gaudí's use. Here you have a mythological bird. It's not clear what bird that is. It's kind of like a dragon. When you look at the face, it's much more dragon-like. Perhaps it's a pterodactyl-like form. Perhaps it's something indescribably ancient. Perhaps it's alluding to all those Chinese the ho-ho birds that were a sort of mix of European and Chinese elements. The phoenix image. Don't forget, China has been exporting goods to Europe for 1,000 years by the Silk Road, and much more numerous numbers, many more numerous works came once the maritime routes were established in about 1500 between China and the West. You have this interchange. So don't forget, there's always interchange, particularly with Columbus opening up those maritime routes. And we have this sense of fantasy here that becomes very decorative, very ornamental, and yet has this feel that is so specific to Catalan modernism. If we look just a little closer so that you can see the detail. Okay, look at that dragon-like form. It's kind of phoenix. It's almost skeletal, isn't it? And the interior reflects the exterior motion. This is what it is with Gaudí. I'll give you a word. I'm not going to try and spell it, but I'll give you a German word, and it's called Gesamtkunstwerk. Gesamtkunstwerk. And it means, the nearest translation is an entire work of art. And if you imagine a building, any kind of building, where every single thing is designed in relation to the whole, all the parts, the lintels, the doorways, the doorknobs, the glass, the balconies, the furniture, the painting on the walls, the wallpaper, the light fittings, everything relates to the overall architecture. It is an entire work of art. This is an Art Nouveau thing, and it's a Gaudí thing too. So what you see on the interior is this resonance with the exterior architecture and the exterior ornament here. So this just gives you an idea. And when you look, you know, this is the central atrium, so it soars like a dome in a cathedral. But this is a house. It's a secular building, but it crosses the route between the secular and the sacred. And you have that combination that is so Art Nouveau and so Gaudí of the geometric alongside and opposing the botanical, biological, metamorphic form that you can see in the ironwork as you go up here. So those grid-like forms that you see in the window structures, in the tracery there, which also reference the tracery of Gothic cathedrals, but much more squared off. So if we move into sort of one of the really well-known spaces that you can access, and when you next get a chance to go on a Viking cruise, perhaps you'll have time to go to the Parkwell. And this is a picture that shows it from the outside, and these are the buildings that are the entranceway. So we're looking from inside the park to its exterior, to the town beyond, the city beyond. And so these little gatehouses, they're like something out of a fantasy. I mean, you can almost, with life, if you like, with life imitating art and art imitating life, you get that sense of it when you go to theme parks, don't you? But this is real living architecture within a civic space that is used by the population, the populace of Barcelona, and by visitors. So again, it's kind of, you see Disneyland or, you know, any of the theme parks that you might have visited. I was in Portmeirion in Wales just a few days ago, which was a sort of fantasy village, but to have, you know, real people living there. And you sort of think, oh, it's like a theme park. But of course, theme parks are based on this fantasy architecture. You know, that comes first. But with our 2021 eyes, we can conflate the two and move between this idea of fantasy and reality. But Gaudí essentially was working on a structure of architectural rigor with fantasy and Catalan identity at all times. So we have these minaret forms. You can see the minaret on the right-hand building here, and these strange organic forms, almost like animals, like the backs and the bodies of animals, particularly scaled animals, going towards that dragon again here. Now, if you imagine yourselves standing between these gateposts and turning round and looking back, this is what you're going to see. And you can see more closely, what have we got again? We've got the contrasting tiling, which makes this checkerboard effect. We've got this castellated, remember Montana and his castellated three dragons of 1888, that's all going on at the same time. So we've got this mix between something that's castellated and almost like the plates of a stegosaurus, or like the back of a reptile, you know, a modern day stegosaurus, if you like. And again, this curvilinear aspect, this slightly melted type of form that is so Art Nouveau. Nothing's really sharp. It's got a sort of soft edge to it that makes it something that invites you to touch it. We move a bit further on and round the outside. This is what the outside of this viewing platform in the Park Well looks like. And when you go up close, as you see on the right-hand image, you can see the level of detail that Gaudí goes to make the decorative elements focus attention when you're both near and from a distance. So the overall design will draw you in from a distance. And then you look at the detail, and it's finished not only with shaping that is painstakingly done in this technique, which I'll explain in a moment, but also colour is so important, and it's that sense of being embraced by the architecture. Now, I've spelled on the bottom right of the screen here, trencadith, okay? This is the technique that Gaudí uses, and it's known by other names as well. It's basically a kind of mosaic. Its English form, you would just call it broken tile mosaic. That's maybe the easiest way of remembering it. Also shardware. Shards are the fragments of broken pottery. You can call it shardware. So it's made from broken chinaware that are cemented together on this bed of cement, like mosaic, but not, whereas mosaic's done with these tesserae of glass and of mineral forms, and they're usually in regular shapes. This, of course, has got that irregularity, that crazy paving look. And you will have sometimes other materials like shells or buttons. Okay, and so it's this fantasy thing that Gaudí has taken from, you know, early originals. Mosaics go right back, of course. You see plenty of Roman mosaics. You see there was a real fantasy period, for example, in the 18th century, where you have shell outbuildings in great estates. Very much from the sort of Venetian traditions, but building this fantasy shell like constructions, very, very Rococo, so mid-18th century. So it's an idea that Gaudí has taken, and he's made it into a new form here. So these materials, there's also a sense of recycling, of time immemorial, because the recycling of these broken forms is also creating the sense of living architecture, because it's living from the past and it's reincarnated like a phoenix into the present, into Gaudí's present. If you look at these gates, what are they like? They're exactly like those at Wells Estate, the first estate. So you've got that repetition of form here. Again, these themes carry on. It's like you can see this wonderful palm, you know, where it explodes like a hand, or like a starfish here. That repetition of form, that continuation, that building of a style that makes him inimicable. Because if you did start to imitate, you would say you're doing something like Gaudí. He makes it his own. And that repetition builds his brand, if you like, to take marketing speak. The theme continues, and here we have that dragon theme. Now, one of the famous elements within the Park Güell is the salamander, which I haven't shown you here because I'm showing you another dragon form here. The salamander conflated with the dragon. Again, this thematic, very Catalan, St. George, killing of the dragon, and of course the Hercules' Ladon, conflated with Columbus through Catalan poetry of the 19th century. Here you can see it really quite clearly with the Casa Bayo. And if you look at the roof on the left-hand side, where you see the whole building, many commentators have said, well, it's like the undulating back of a dragon, or a salamander if you want to go to non-mythological forms, that the roof forms that organic whole. Remember that organic element that's so part of Art Nouveau. What you're seeing here is also the colour that is so part of Gaudí's work. When you look like a facade on a bright day, like you see on the left-hand side, you can see all the colour and how it's so unlike buildings that we associate with 19th century Europe. And also the skull-like structure of the balconies here, which recall the structure of a reptile's head. These underlying organic forms. These are close-ups, the middle and the right-hand side image are close-ups which really show the way he uses trincadis, this mosaic tile form, and how subtle the use of colour is to gain not only local colour, but a sense of light and shade, which he creates over the back of this creature that forms the roof. And again, with this sort of minaret type form you see in the central image here, it's got that feeling of something that's church-like, and yet it's also this sort of fantasy like we saw in the gateway to the Park Güell. So it's a combination of minaret, of finial, of church spire. You've got all these resonances and nuances. If we just go a little closer, these are photographs I took on the Viking cruise I did in October 2019. I had just a few hours in Barcelona and only time to see one building really well, so I chose this one. Some of the glass on the right hand side, it's not pottery but glass, and of course it's transparent, so you're seeing the colour of the plaster underneath on the right hand image. And let's think of him internationally again. Let's re-put him back into that context. So the central and left hand images are ones I took of the central atrium in Casa Bayo, which are shaded in blue. You see the light through to the dark blues. And on the left hand side, you're looking up to the skylight of that central atrium. And in the central picture, you're looking from the outside down. So we're looking at the same piece of skylight here. And I just want you to compare it, what's going on. The Metropolitan, the Porte Dauphiné again in Paris, this insect-like form, this interest in biological forms becoming architectural forms. He's absolutely in the midst of Art Nouveau, but with his own take. This shows the interior, so again moving from outside to inside, and that resonance between the two. Here you can see something that recalls trincadis, but is actually painted gold, sort of crazy paving here. It also recalls, for me, and this is because I'm the long-standing interest in Asian art, it's almost like the kintsugi that you have on Japanese and also Korean, but those mending something that's broken. So if you have a vase that's broken, kintsugi, you will mend with gold so that the mending is visible. So for me personally, I get those feelings of resonance between cultures as well. But it really depends how you see it, what it appeals to you. Perhaps for those of you who have reptiles as pets or keep tortoises or whatever, it might take you back to that sort of reptilian format. And that idea of softness, of something slightly melted. If you look at the right-hand image, it's like a tree, but again, softened off. It's like an organic form, but softened and melted. And if you think, I don't know if any of you have ever been to something that's called a Steiner school, Rudolf Steiner, who was a German educator, very controversial because of certain beliefs. But in Steiner school architecture, you get this same use of forms that are not sharp edged, that is typical of Gaudí and typical of Art Nouveau. And here again, I love this picture. I tried to get it without too many people, but it's that was about a 2-second gap, that image on the right there, where there was nobody in the passageway. This is up in the attics, and here you can see that catenary arch, more like the left-hand one than the right-hand one, which is, I don't know which is parabolic or not, but you can see again that giveaway shape that's so part of Gaudí's oeuvre. Let's think bigger. Let's think perhaps more towards many people who are listening tonight, and we'd be thinking of something like the St. Louis Arch. That's the world's tallest arch, and of course it's a catenary arch. So Eero Saarinen designs this form. It goes right back. I mean, it's ancient as a form, the catenary shape, because it is so strong. Okay, so much later, of course, than Gaudí, but again, this elegance and the organic nature of it. It's architecture, but it's organic architecture. Here's the dragon. I thought I'd put him in. That was just as a reminder there to show you what was in the parkwell here, and look at the back of that dragon. How like the roof of the Casa Bayo it is. And in the last 10 minutes, I just want to move towards, what is absolutely Gaudí's best known work, and that is the Sagrada Família. And the Sagrada Família, this is one image. It's changing all the time. It's still a living building. I saw one of the questions that when is it going to be completed? Hopefully 2026. But did you know, it's one of those did you know moments, that it wasn't actually dedicated until 2010. And here's Pope Benedict the 16th, and I've included a quote because he talks about Gaudí conflating Gaudí's work with the work of the church, and he says that in building Sagrada Família, Gaudí overcame the division between human consciousness and Christian consciousness, the earth, the heavens, between living in the temporal world and being open to eternal life, earth and heaven, between the beauty of things and God as beauty, the earth, heaven, not with words, but with stones, lines, planes and points. Indeed, beauty is one of mankind's greatest needs. It is the root from which the branches of our peace and the fruits of our hope come forth. Beauty also reveals God, because like him, a work of beauty is pure gratuity. It calls us to freedom and draws us away from selfishness. This is only 11 years ago that it was dedicated. So what's going to happen then? Well, the plan is that the foundation stone, which was laid back in 1882, the plan is to complete by the 2026, which is the centenary of Gaudí's death. And what I've also wanted to point out here was a very unusual alignment, because as many of you will know, altarpieces in Christian churches face east, almost exclusively. But because of the site that Gaudí had and the unusual shape, and when you go and see the church, you can see how crammed in it is. It hasn't got great big grounds around it. You're really crammed between streets. The altar actually aligns, rather than aligning east, it aligns northwest. So it's a very, very unusual church. I think this model is helpful to see how it will look as an object when it's completed with that central spire. And you can see from the image on the left that that central spire is what is currently being built. So there are always cranes and building materials around the church. It's the one time we get to kind of see what medieval people and Renaissance people must have seen all the time. We've only ever seen great, grand church buildings finished. And to see something of that kind of scale and enormous ambition being realised, of course, is a privilege in itself, even while we might want to see it finished. And you know, if we look at, sorry, I'm just trying to get this to move forward. If you look from a number of different angles to give you a sense of this building as object, you can see those sorts of almost castellation, that feel of the castellated building there, of that sense of the organic here. Here's the central spire growing. Okay, here at this side, which you can just see in the distance, they're the towers with the tetramorphs, the 4 evangelists, who of course are human being, lion, bull and eagle. The 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. If we move to a CGI elevation, this is what you see happening in the next few years. So work started on the central spire in 2018. It will reach 170 metres, making it the tallest church in the world. And that is 1 metre less than Mount Montjuïc. And Montjuïc is the mountain and the source of the sandstone that is Barcelona's hill. And Gaudí says that even worship, anything made by mankind, cannot beat nature. So he made the spire design just 1 metre smaller than the top of Mount Montjuïc. To compare, anyone who's ever seen Salisbury Cathedral, which is the tallest spire in Britain, that's 123 metres. So to give you a visual, this is what Salisbury looked like. Cathedrals take a really long time to build. The foundation stones of Salisbury were laid in 1220. The nave, west front, transept, cloisters and chapter house are completed by 1266. So that 46 years is very fast. And then you have a gap, and the spire is completed between 1300 and 1320. And the new chapels added both inside and outside, it's the 1400s, and building going on till 1526. So in those 306 years, we have Salisbury finished. So actually 140 odd years for Gaudí's Sagrada Família is not too bad. And to put into context, how is he being like a classic church architect? Well, he's looking at those Gothic originals. As I said at the beginning, that medieval inspiration includes Gothic church building. I've given you an example here of the tympana, which are the semicircular areas above the doorways where you go into churches, and in Romanesque and Gothic design, the west front, so the side where you would go through the doors, and the altar at the east end will be facing you at the end. So the west front is always the site of the biggest sculpture, and quite often you have the Last Judgment as the theme for sculpture in the west front. It's reminding you to behave yourself and to say that, you know, remember, if you don't, what happens to the good? They have a lovely time on the right hand side of God, and the bad, they suffer for life eternal. So behave yourselves. And notice here the structure of this central large tympana with all the voussoir carving above it, and the flanking archways that you see here. So this is just a visual to show you what Gaudí was thinking of structurally. And here you have his inimicable catenary or parabolic arch shape, that sort of melting form, and this mass of biological material that you can see. So this is the nativity entrance. Nothing, because it's not facing east, nothing is where it normally is on churches, so the nativity facade is facing northeast, and you have faith, hope and charity. Charity is the central structure there. Let's look a bit closer, see what we can see. Well, that's obviously where all the action is. The whole focus of attention on the nativity is Christ and Mary, his mother here with Joseph. And this, as I said, is made with the sandstone from the local mountain, from Montjuïc. And this is a very interesting thing because Gaudí used actually what was an ancient Greek technique, which is taking life casts from real people. So he used local people here. He took molds of them, and from that he cast plaster casts. And then from the plaster cast, you get the normal sort of pointing technique where you transfer the design to stone carving. I teach sculptors. I work in an art school as an art historian for the very people who do this nowadays. So of living beings, and that goes right back to the ancient Greeks. Really interesting thing with the ancient Greeks, if you take the Riace bronzes, which were discovered in the sea in the 1970s off the coast of Calabria, and you look at the feet of those bronzes, you will see that on the underside they are clearly weight bearing. You see the flesh squashed, which means they come from life casts. So we have an ancient technique in the creation of the sculptural forms. And just the idea of a living form. Here are the doors. A close-up here of the work of a brilliant Japanese artist, Etsuro Sutu, who has worked on the charity doors of the nativity facade here. And those colours that, you know, we know are so Gaudí, he's working to those designs. So it's ongoing there, he is still working. The Passion facade, which is on the southwest side, the foundations were laid in 1954, so 30 years after Gaudí's death, and we have a totally different style of sculpture here, as you can see. You know, in Britain, you might think, oh, Coventry Cathedral here, you might think of Eric Gill, sculptors like that, the direct carving sculptors. These are by an artist living, you know, he's still doing these sculptures, called Josep Subaracht, and he was commissioned in the 1980s and 86 to start his work on the ongoing Passion facade. And you can see his sculpture here, of course, Christ's Passion, that story of his trial and death and resurrection and so on. Here we have that critical moment of the crucifixion. And above it, just to give you context, this is what these spire-like, minaret-like, organic forms look like. So we've got that mix, very dynamic. And close up you can see Christ. This is above the crucifixion, Christ carrying the cross to Calvary. So it's a narrative form, just as you'd see in Gothic sculpture, where you're telling a story very clearly for people who can't read, for illiterate. And so it's a narrative form that comes right from that tradition of church architecture and sculptural decoration and painted decoration. And here we have Veronica with the image of Christ on her veil, and that's actually a portrait of Gaudí. But look at those metallic forms. They're like the work of a British artist called David Sandel, who does these sorts of you know, computer age type forms, the geometry of fear group sculptors in the 1950s, British sculptors who did this sort of work. So it's very much sort of reflecting the period in which work has started. That allusion, St. George and the dragon, the patron saint. We even have that here. And here, I just couldn't resist this. You don't have to agree with me, but I think there's so much allusion to ancient sculpture here. In the left-hand side, you see the soldiers who are playing dice. on this Passion facade, and it immediately made me think the angle of the right-hand figure here, Rodin's Thinker. And Rodin's Thinker itself is a memory shot of the Belvedere torso in the Vatican. Okay, so you have sculptural history carrying on through in this living church. And here you have organic forms. They're like, you know, like it's like a forest of trees, isn't it? Going up like giant redwoods of California, soaring up into the heavens here with the bosses, you know, like medieval bosses here. And, you know, you look at this and it is like a forest on the inside. Again, reflecting that organic living exterior. And this real sense of living, breathing architecture. When the light comes through the stained glass, of course, it's like a kaleidoscope, and it comes alive like a stage set. And you might think, this is completely new. Nobody's ever done trees like this before. I mean, we're used to columns, aren't we? And we're used to sort of the carvings on the capitals of columns in Romanesque and Gothic churches, all coming from, of course, Roman columns and the Corinthian style, etc., etc. You think, so where has this come from? But of course, he's an architect. He's an intellectual. He knows art history. This is my guess. I haven't read it anywhere, but we know that you have organic forms in earlier buildings. So on the far right, we have it in Germany, which is something called Astwerk, Branchwerk. If ever you go to Munich to a beer festival and go into a beer cellar, and if you look on the ceiling, usually there's trees painted. There's a whole wonderful book, of course, about that with that tradition, with Simon Schama, Landscape and Memory, where he talks about this identification of German nationalism with the woods, the wildlands, all comes from Tacitus. And in Italy too, Bramante's cloister in the San Ambrogio in Milan, organic form. So there are architectural precedents, but he goes with his wonderful imagination. Even the bosses that you see here, of course, have precedents in medieval architecture, like Saint-Séverin in Paris. But he works with established norms and builds his own identifiable forms. And I'll just finish with what colour does. So the stained glass windows, it's an artist who's been working since 1999, Joan Via e Grau, and he has been there for 22 years and works only with abstract. He doesn't do anything figurative. And Grau himself says about the use of abstraction, he says, for me, it was necessary to create an atmosphere, a grand symphony of colour and light. And with that, he's absolutely answering the extraordinary imagination that Gaudí possessed and that was in all his buildings, and that extraordinary sense of kaleidoscopic vision. And I just finish now by saying, why is it we like Gaudí so much? And I can only say why I like it so much. And I equate it to, if you imagine the Apollonian, the Bacchanalian image, reason and thought and reserve against letting go and the world of the senses being the opposite. So as opposed to your classical statuary, which is all about reserve, harmony, balance, the world being in order, mankind being a representation of world order, of cosmos, all that classical thought, and always balancing that is you have the Bacchanal, like Bruegel in Carnival and Lent, like some wonderful imagination of a Flemish primitive like Hieronymus Bosch. Why do we love it? It's because it engages our senses. We can engage our intellect. You can look, I hope I've shown you the structures and the references to archaeological art history, architectural history, to national identity, to the Hispano-Moresque, to medieval Gothic, to Catalan identity, to the Greek myth of Hercules and the Lagon and Christopher Columbus. I hope I brought that all together for you. and setting Gaudí within that international milieu of Art Nouveau geniuses, and say that finally it comes back that we love it because it engages our senses. We can hear the colour, synesthesia, we can hear the colour, we can almost taste the colour. And I think that's why Gaudí is the master builder of Barcelona. And with that, I say thank you very much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this evening. So any questions? I'll just go into the questions that I see now. So Alice, the first question from the 13th of July was, my favourite building. I think at the moment it has to be the Casa Bayo, simply because I've seen it in more detail than the others, but I didn't get to see the interior of Sagrada Familia, so I'm sort of almost saving myself to be blown away. You have to book so well in advance. But yeah, the Casa Bayo, I spent hours there. I just absolutely loved it. Carola and Bill, the term organic, human habitation in the natural world. Yes, I think of organic, if you think of what grows naturally, that organic forms are forms of the earth. So it would be all foliage, it would be all fauna as well as flora, and it would also be the elements that make up those. So also organic, you can sort of imagine running soil between your fingers, that sort of textural relationship between observation and really sort of feeling. It sort of engages the tactile, but it's about the natural world and shapes that occur naturally. So it would contrast with sort of sharp corners and geometry, for example, meaning sharp-edged geometry is the organic form, is that fluid type of form. Yes, I love the cheese. Yes, Kathy. Yeah, the trees of colour. It's just amazing. But I knew, because I knew one of my students had done his dissertation on Astwerk, and I learned a lot from him about this earlier form. And you see it particularly in Germanic building and Germanic Renaissance building. This love of nature. If you do read Simon Schama, the idea of Tacitus, he described the Germans as people of the forest, and the reason why Hitler liked Tacitus so much, Germania so much, was because it described Germans as people who are unmixed with others. So he actually used the great Tacitus to justify his vision of effectively eugenics. So but actually what Tacitus talked about is how the German peoples, the tribes in the 1st century AD, of course the wars with Rome, were at one with the natural world, as if they came from the woods themselves. So that tradition is very deep in Germany, but it's also there in, you know, showing you at San Ambrogio, for example, the idea of columns being trees, being trunks of wood, going right back to Greek building, where the columns originally, before building in stone, would have been made of wood. And of course Greek architecture, temple architecture, is very much based on wooden precedents, wooden buildings beforehand. Yes, so Poonam, architectural integrity, I would, yeah, you can easily fill a week in Barcelona. And if you want to combine it with the Art Viking tour, because you can either begin or end a cruise there, I would definitely add a few days, because there is so much to look at. And it's not just Gaudí. I've picked out the best known, but of course Montana himself and other architects of the Catalan Renaissance are really well worth looking at. Yeah, I would definitely do that. Showing the buildings, Karen. Yeah, I've selected a few of the buildings, so you can rewatch this. It's all recorded, so you can rewatch this. I've taken a few pieces of Gaudí's oeuvre here. One thing I would say is, if you're in Spain for longer, go to Asturias, which is in northern Spain, in Galicia, and go and see Gaudí's sort of mad fantasy castle in Asturias. It is brilliant. I saw it when I was 19 and I've never forgotten. Thank you, Letitia. Yeah, synesthesia, tasting the colours. If you want to read a bit further about that, read Kandinsky. Kandinsky writing about synesthesia, where music is in colours, and he describes the rooftops in Russian cities as all these colours. So it's a wonderful thing, synesthesia. Thank you. So I'm trying to go down a bit. So I'm going to just go to the bottom. So Pat, I hope I answered your question. Sagrada Familia planning to be finished 2026 for the centenary of Gaudí's death. Jeannie, yes, absolutely. Love this place as well. And yes, Mika, if you get to go back to Barcelona, you'll see Sagrada Familia much evolved from last time you were there, if it was 20 years ago. And how were Gaudí's building received? Yeah, it's basically, as he got more famous, as his career went on, they were really positively received. Where he, I think it was the Casa, it might have been the Casa Vicens, I think it was the Casa Vicens, was entered into a competition for the sort of outstanding building of the year in Barcelona, and he actually lost out to another architect. So although he was considered brilliant, people did find him quite difficult, and I think without the support of Güell, you know, this incredibly rich man, that without his support, the continuity of his climb, and he died by accident. He was run over, and he'd ended his life, whether it was mental illness or not, you know, somewhat unwell. But also the Casa Bayo and the Bayo family were actually so separate from Güell, incredibly rich textile baron was Bayo. And actually, as much as anything, it was the support of these really high-profile people. Patronage is such an integral part of the art world that's sort of more attention is being paid to it now with academic study, but some of his more difficult works, it was the support of these very well-placed, wealthy people that allowed him to continue. So he wasn't always received that positively, but as time went on, more so. Do Viking cruises take you to see Gaudí's architecture? That's from Sharon. What you do is you come into the port, so you'll see the Columbus 1888 monument there, and then you can either do a tour that Viking organises, or if you want to specifically see one thing really well, then you can literally get on and off. There's an off-on many circular routes you can do, and you can just jump to the places you want or take a taxi. It's not an awful lot of time there, so I mean it's a good place to add a few days if you want to sort of top or tail your trip. How much do you think, this is from Wendell, how much do you think Gaudí's style has in turn gone on to influence architects who followed him? That's a really good question, and it's maybe just something you have to sort of have an individual opinion on, but personally I think that first of all he's working within that Art Nouveau greater whole, and what I'll do is I'll just take us back to it. Got a pretty picture. So working within Art Nouveau, and Art Nouveau itself falls well and truly out of fashion by about 1920 in the rest of Europe. So his Catalan modernism, and don't forget he starts work on this in 1882, Sagrada Familia. So although he lives until 1926, Art Nouveau at that time is out of fashion. So as a big movement, it's already been displaced, and particularly because of the First World War, where it sort of represents an era, the Belle Epoque, and in France, for example, that fracture happens, and it's very much Art Deco as the leading consumer style at the time, and of course international modernism in the more elite artistic circles, and so later architects following him, he's out of style by the time he dies in terms of cutting edge trends, whether they're commercial or whether they're elite artistic circles. And the appreciation really sort of Art Nouveau generally really comes back in the sort of 1960s, 1970s. So he's appreciated, and the fact is that the building is being finished. It hasn't been left as a sort of grand monument to sort of unfinished ambition. But he is hugely important within Catalan modernism, and of course UNESCO shows that by how many of his sites, as well as the sites of others, are part of the in the International Heritage List, the world list. So Christina, why do you keep Christopher Columbus as Portuguese? Why do I keep referring to him as Portuguese? Let me check to see if I've actually had a mad moment. I might well have done. I thought he was a Portuguese citizen, but he worked for the Spain. I'm sorry, you're quite right. He's Italian. Yeah, I just had a mad moment. I knew he wasn't Spanish. Yeah, thanks very much for that question. So mea culpa there. Did Gaudí select the tiles and or the design of broken tiles, or did he leave that to the installer? He did the overall design. I don't know how closely he got to the tiny details, but he certainly designed the that it was to be in Trencadis of the broken tiles, and he had the overall colour and the sort of light and shade. I don't know whether he actually went as far as selecting the individual tiles. I suspect not, but I might be wrong. What biblical elements did Gaudí reflect in his architecture? So if we look at Sagrada Família, that's, because the other buildings I looked at are not sacred architecture. So you have obviously within the tympana and the three different facades, it's absolutely about biblical stories. So we have the Passion facade, we have the Nativity facade, we have the Gloria facade, which is still being built, and the four evangelists, the tetramorph, so absolutely responding to what it is, which is a sacred building. I think he alludes to church spires stroke minarets in many of his secular buildings, so there's a sort of cathedral-like space. Also, he tends to do these huge central atria where they're double or triple height spaces, which again is referencing church architecture, whether it's a dome or whether it's a vaulted central space at the crossing of a Western church. So there, and you can say that about other architects. If you look at the Chrysler building, for example, that is a sort of cathedral-like form, particularly with the gargoyles on the outside of the eagle, which references the guardians of the sacred space, as well as the useful elements of church architecture to take water off the roofs. And so you often find that sense of the sacred within secular buildings in 20th century work. I just see, go to the top now. Thank you, Hal. Yeah, thank you. Yes, so married to a Portuguese. I know he was in service in Portugal before working for the Spanish royal family. Will I be on the September 4th cruise from Iceland to Barcelona? Thank you, Jane. I don't think I can yet, but I think maybe next year I hope to do something again. I'm too tied up with work here to do anything before that. But thank you for asking. But you visited Kathy. You visited Barcelona in 2019. Photographed Sagrada Família from the outside. Incredible colours, and your senses came alive. That's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah, you can just taste that colour, can't you? And Jorg, I'm happy to send you some of the bits from this. Yes, if you contact me via LinkedIn, that information should all be there, and I can reply to you then. Lovely. I think I've answered all the questions there, and yeah, I think that's it. And I will never make the mistake again of calling Columbus Portuguese. Of course, he was born in Genoa. He spent his early years in Portugal. But yes, thank you. Stand corrected. And thank you, Thomas and Mary Lou. That's very kind. Your compliment. So I hope that's that. I think that's everything. I'm glad you've enjoyed it and got some great questions there. So thank you very much.